go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Ask Anything, brought to you by Moser Consulting. I'm Angel Leon, your host and Moser's Director of Personnel. We're thrilled to have you with us today for this episode of Ask Anything. For today, we're talking about one of our favorite topics, really ever, AI. But this time, we're talking about AI ethics and bias with two of Moser Consulting's own, Nathan Rinard and John Caviness. Let's welcome them back to the show. Gentlemen, welcome back to Ask Anything. John, you are a ASCII Anything just I feel like we should be in the Hall of Fame if we would ever have one.
If we have one, I
Um,
want to be in it. Yeah.
yeah. And Nathan, this is your second time, right? If I
Yeah,
remember
I think so.
correctly,
Second or
Nathan?
third. Yeah.
I think it's actually third. Yeah.
Yeah, I
And
think
John,
it's actually okay.
yeah, with the crowdsourcing episodes you participated in, I don't know what the
Right.
status directly under co-host would be, but I'm pretty sure you've attained it. Like, you
Yeah,
should
yeah.
be eligible for a free frozen yogurt at some point if we just keep punching your card.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I know John for sure is has definitely punched out his card. He's getting a free drink right now as we speak. But well, gentlemen, welcome back. AI, as I mentioned, is honestly one of our favorite topics to talk about always. Because I feel like we spoke about AI, John, with you at some point during last season, and I feel like we've come, 5 times different than where we were last season. But let's start with AI bias and how does it occur?
Yeah, so AI bias for the listeners out there, they're gonna like the news media, depending on who you ask, you might get a different answer. It's important to kind of have a universal definition, and that's generally speaking going to be systematic and unfair discrimination in AI systems based on the data that it's given will result in outcomes that favor certain groups over others. This can happen at various stages, right? So if it's the data collection stage where if the data being fed to a model isn't fully representative or has some historical bias, there's a lot of examples of that in like policing algorithms and other areas. The AI model may accidentally kind of learn and perpetuate those, right? Or if it's more in the feature selection stage where if you're designing a model to do something in particular, it might come to pass that you might end up with skewed results, even if the data is technically sound, right? So from like a data perspective, it's all good data. However, it could still reflect missing pieces that could lead to a bad result, right? And then last but not least, obviously part of that with bias is going to be the algorithm's design. Does it inherently favor certain types of data over others? Is that being trained against positively or negatively with the model? Those are kind of like parts of what are going to flow into AI bias. But I know, Nathan, like with your experience, what are your 2 cents on kind of the bias problem with AI?
I think that's spot on. I would dig in a little bit more maybe on the training kind of shown to models. I would dig in a little more to the bias pushed into models through training data, because I think we may narrow the scope too tightly sometimes in conversations where we're talking about a company or individuals wanting to build their own personal model and they're wanting to make sure that it's not biased. So they maybe take something off the shelf and they want to make sure that the data they're providing it is representative of their personnel, their perspective, the data they care about. I think the other side of that is understanding that the open models, whether it be ChatGPT, Claude, all the things out there, they're using publicly created data sets, right? So that ranges from more like hard data, if that's a thing. So, like census data, things like that, traffic violations, whatever public data might be, but it also branches out into literary works, right? So there's books in libraries that have been digitized and then fed into these models going back, forever, right? So, and the way they spoke and thought about things at a different point in time than today can be introducing bias to these models. And additionally, you could have literary work today written in such a fashion that it uses language that you would not want the model to output, right? You wouldn't want to use that language in everyday speech, just provocative language, right? You wouldn't want to
Yeah.
have the model output that.
Like you don't want to feed a model at like Reddit data, right? Like that's an easy call out. There's certain
Absolutely
things on
no.
the internet that like, yeah, so training's essential to mitigate bias, right? Obviously, like ensuring ethical and fair AI systems is a pretty big ask, right? Just because there's so many factors. The data it's being fed, how it's trained. Is there a good process of regular audits of what's actually being introduced as bias that is kind of hard to forecast, right? Making sure that you have a diverse team of people behind that endeavor to have different perspectives to bring to the table to say, hey, noticing this here, that could be a problem. Like we need to do something about that. I think it's important to have more eyes on it more than doing it in a kind of a black hole. I just wanted to kind of add that in.
I think something else that's interesting is the idea of using synthetic data to train models. That's becoming ever more popular as we're somehow supposedly running out of data to train these models. They're relying on models to create synthetic data. And there were some students at Rice University that did some studies. There's an article out there, I believe When AI Models Go Mad is the title. But basically what they found is that like an LLM model, whenever you train it on synthetic data, it takes about 5 iterations for it to just generate garbage. Some practical concern there, potentially the number of folks that are utilizing LLMs to create data today, right? And it's ending up out on the web, whether that be corporate websites, LinkedIn posts, all these things that could get pushed back into a model without knowing that it's synthetic data. What is that doing to the underlying model? So there's some concern in our ability to kind of control what data is real and what data is just the model satisfying itself.
Yeah, and I think it's cool that you bring that paper into the picture because I think that MAD like acronym, like the actual like acronym, I encourage people to go look at this paper, obviously, but like it's actually describing a condition, right? So model autophagy disorder is that MAD acronym, right?
Acronym.
Which is where they kind of like develop this condition of synthetic data based on previous generation of models that don't have the infusion of real world data, which then causes that sort of there's like a principle in philosophy, I believe, where if you take an image, make a replication of it, after you get about 5 replications away, the 5th replication of the original image looks nothing like it, and it's like a topsy-turvy, upside down, completely different thing. It's pretty apparent, right, to people that are working with these models and training them because they'll start seeing a decline in quality of the diversity of the outputs, right? They'll kind of see an amplification of artifacts and biases will start presenting themselves. Convergence towards the average response rather than nuanced responses and outputs. So I think it's a good point that you brought that in, Nathan, because I didn't even think to bring that into the fold here with the conversation. But kind of going back to the original question, right? AI bias, we're aware it's a thing. We know how it's presented itself historically to an extent, right? We've seen it with all kinds of attempts with, even the most simplest models. I think something that I've personally noticed if I go to something like a GPT, I've stopped caring about some of the responses it gives me because they're too vague. It's not giving me the right information. It's started to kind of lean towards this, well, this satisfies most of the requests that I get. That's good enough for me, right? And when I get a response like that, a publicly available one, right? My first impulse is to tell it to drill in and give me more details and expand on that concept, right? To see what it comes back with. And oftentimes I'll find that I need to completely reset my window, right? Reload, close that thread, start over, give it a much better premise. With the GPTs of the world, the more you feed into your first question, right, the better response you're going to get. The more context you provide it, the more likely you are to get a useful result. That's you having to kind of go around maybe a training limitation that's in place, or the fact that it's such a generalized tool that you have to kind of augment how you're approaching it, right? But when you're creating one of these things, either for a business use case, a personal use case, or if you're just a nerd like some of us, and enjoy doing things that are kind of on the
Nothing
novel
wrong with
end,
that.
right?
Nothing wrong with that.
I think one of the most important things is having diverse data sets. Like when you started talking about synthetic data, Nathan, my first thought was like, with synthetic data, how good can the diversity be within fake information? And there's so much data out there that is pretty available. Like you referenced earlier with census data and statistical data there are constantly studies showing that there's discrimination and bias within even those statistics, right? So how do you fight that? It's more information, right? You got to give other, I guess the word would be branches for the models to look at and correlate and find a way to tie together in a more cohesive, unbiased way. And that helps reduce stereotyping and bad representation and poor results and biased results.
I like the point you made about feeding it more context at first, instead of just giving it a 10-word sentence and basically expecting to get a perfect answer right off the bat. That's normally what's not going to happen. You have to actually go deeper and give it more context, give it more meat to that bone so that it can go deeper and give you probably a better meaning of what you're looking for. That, I think, is the key. So we've talked about what AI bias is. What are the ethical implications of biased AI? How can companies ensure that their AI systems are ethical and fair? I think you guys kind of alluded to this a little bit about the garbage data, right? The information that you feed that system. How does that work with making sure that we have an ethical, unbiased AI?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways companies can approach this, right? Like if they're a consumer of the model, it probably starts with having a policy in place, right? So making sure that your workforce has the training they need to understand what this is and what it's not. There's a lot of folks that haven't gotten training on AI. They've only seen it in movies, right? So having a corporate policy and then training around what it is, what it's not, how you can use it, what are some gotchas? Because we started off pretty heavy, right? Talking about bias and the things that can go kind of sideways, and some of that, if not all of that, is out of the consumer's hands, right? But how can they make the most of this tool without having to be as concerned about bias, accuracy, things like that? And I think the first step is, documenting and training how to use it. I think a big one there is making sure that people know that they can't just use whatever the thing creates, right? Because it's a very powerful assistant, right? So that's a bit of an overplayed word, maybe assistant or co-pilot, but that's really what it is, right? It's not the pilot flying the plane, but it is a very, very good co-pilot. So having the training, to John's point, to understand how I can prompt this thing appropriately to get the response I want back and eliminate bias in that way, right? So some examples of that would be, as a consumer, maybe I'm a school teacher and I want to have some assistance in checking out essays. Maybe I don't include, or in fact, I shouldn't include the student's name in that, because names, the model can make assumptions about who that person is based off their name and weight that against things it thinks it knows about persons with that name. So that's bias right there, right? We do not want people to receive a different grade based on their name, right? Like that has nothing to do with the merit, the worthiness of the essay. So we need to make sure that anything like that example gets removed altogether, right? And that's in our hands. We can do that just by ensuring we prompt it effectively.
Yeah, and I think you made a really good point with the essay thing, and there's a whole lot of other like similar situations that I think AI is starting to get pulled into where folks might be going a little rogue, right? Like out there, I work with quite a lot of companies. They're always asking me about AI. I give them my soapbox spiel about like, don't include anything that you consider to be a secret about your organization. Don't include proprietary information. Make a point to anonymize and create vaguer versions of your information when you put it into any of these things. Because if it's a platform that you don't necessarily know through and trust, or you haven't built, there isn't much you can do with what you've given it once you've given it something. But I think the ethical implications of biased AI are pretty intense. Like if you look at IBM and Google, they probably spent more money than we can imagine on trying to fix the tools that they made, right, with Watson. I know Google has a suite of AIs that they've tried and failed and recreated and decreated and started over and have whole teams of people that they're throwing at it. But the simplest implications in the ethical space with biased AI are pretty straightforward. Loss of trust, right? If you're an organization and you're relying on AI and you get a hallucinated result or put that forward as someone else's work, that can lead to a pretty awkward conversation that results in your organization having a worse reputation. Accountability issues. If you've got bad biased outcomes coming out of an AI system and you're relying on those as for parts of your workflows, that can create accountability issues, even liability issues for an organization. If you look at it more of a macro kind of social level, obviously, right, discrimination against people, social inequality can be exacerbated by these things. Something that I've noticed more about the advertising space. And what I'm kind of thinking we're in is this kind of like gold rush of AI, right? Like a .com boom, whatever you want to call it. We're kind of neighboring on those kind of precipices of social change, right? A lot of people are boldly going forward without thinking about what it's going to be like 5 years from now. Like you said at the beginning of the hour here, Angel, even in our last AI conversation, so much has changed since then, and that wasn't even last year. That was maybe 4 months ago. The steps that, like, forget the name of the technology universal, but it's more related to CPU needs, where every 3 months the capacity necessary for the highest end technologies, like CPU performance, is going to exponentially increase over time. From the outset to any time forward. Over the course of months, years, it's going to just keep going up. With AI, at the same time, if we're not being careful about bias, we're not thinking about implications of ethical impact with these systems, if we're not ensuring that training is good, the data sets it's working with are good, and then constantly revisiting those, over time, if we get too reliant on them, we're going to end up tripping over our own feet. And that could cause all kinds of problems for not just the people working with the AI, but the people that might be impacted by what those AIs are used for. Often, right, like I was kind of saying earlier, I talked about having diverse teams, having regular audits of the data and also the results, having an ethics committee. Not a bad idea, right? That sounds like a weird thing, but I know depending on organizational structure and availability and purpose of what an organization might be doing with AI, it's important to have a group of people, either stakeholders in the org or just people that have a good center around what is a good or bad decision or what is a good or bad implication of a use case of an AI. That should be an essential piece of the recipe if you're trying to avoid stepping on your own foot when you're playing with AI. Is having that kind of central body that can be like, oh, we should probably do something about that as soon as we see it. Or, hey, we noticed it's starting to do this. We need to course correct, pull it out of production for a bit, find a way to go back, fix it, if you will, as we say in IT all the time, and then revisit and redeploy. But it's always going to be tricky. And I think the interesting part, I alluded to this with IBM, one of their success stories is they created a fairness toolkit that provides the algorithms and gives them metrics to detect, mitigate, and deal with bias presented by their models. They not only built an AI model to do something, they also built a way to keep it in check. And then Google has taken more of a principles-based approach, right? Where they will intently design what they're working on to emphasize things like fairness, accountability, transparency for their processes. They've even conducted a bunch of research just in the facial recognition technologies, which historically has been wildly bad when it comes to dealing with bias in diverse audiences, right? Just like if you look at historically, Siri used to have a really hard time with accents. Like you could speak English, if you had an accent, it would not know what you're saying. They have done a lot to fix that. I know personally, having worked with a lot of Microsoft products, a lot of what they focus on is inclusivity and fairness and more of a guidelines around responsible AI, right? So maybe it's not as full-fledged as IBM's toolkit, but it's still a good start, right? That gives them at least a leg to stand on to say, hey, we're doing something here, right? So I think it's important for anyone that's going into this space to think of, okay, there are success stories. There are a lot of failure stories. What can we learn from both of them to not repeat those mistakes or maybe enhance those results of those successes?
Yeah, I think that's a really good segue, right? Like we took a look at the consumer and then you spoke a little bit about like the producers of these LLMs, but then there's all those corporations in the middle that want to maybe create a customized bot, whether it's like grounding one of these LLMs against their own data or having a chat bot against a database, things like that. And there's some things they can do there, like going back to like all the big players you just talked about. NIST has created a framework for us to look at, right? So it's not necessarily a rule set that's enforced, right? But it's like, oh, these are some guiding principles that, maybe if you don't have a place to start, this is a good place to look at. And I think there's a couple major ones that kind of stick out to me. You touched on them a little bit, and the first is like making sure the data you're using is accurate and representative of what you want, right? And it may not be that it's actually a larger data set. It may be that it's a very narrow data set, right? So you want your bot to be really good at this thing, and you're just going to use the LLM to do natural language processing, right? So it's not going to deviate from what you know about your data, and you can kind of control things that way a little better, and kind of ensure that it's doing what you need it to do. And then the other side of that is if you are building a bot, you need to be able to make sure it has transparency and explainability features. So if it pumps out an answer, suppose you have a bot that's querying a knowledge base, right? And maybe you have customer service representatives that are, they receive a call and they use this to look up, knowledge base articles. Well, you would want to have some mechanism for proving that what it's giving you is accurate, right?
Yeah,
So
rooted in reality, right?
yeah,
Like having that high quality data, right? That's been checked before it even got into the AI, right? I think that's where you
100%.
were going, right?
Yeah, 100%. So, and a lot of tools do that off the shelf, right? So if you're using Azure's OpenAI service and you ground it against your data using AI search, when you hit that endpoint, it's going to tell you where it got its response, right? It's going to provide you a URL into your blob storage, or it's going to provide you the context for where it did that. And there are a lot of other tools do the same thing. And I think that's critical. One, so you as a developer know that the tool is doing what you need it to do, but also to earn trust from your organization, right? Or your consumer. How does somebody in finance trust this tool you built for them, right? Like finance can't be wrong. So how does your bot earn trust? And this is one method to do that.
Yeah, and removing uncertainty, right? Like basically, like I think if people are looking at finding good training data sets, right, that are out there, obviously don't be looking at Reddit, like I said earlier, but depending on what you're trying to do, a lot of the government and financial data sets from reputable sources. I'm not going to fill in the blanks on what those are, but they're out there, right? If you have like an industry specific data set, maybe there's some kind of organizational group around your industry. Maybe they have conferences. Maybe they have some kind of database that they all tap into, right? I know in the engineering space, the IEEE, that's like a governing body throughout a large portion of that area. They have a lot of data. I'm sure if someone wanted to make an AI based on information with the IEEE's data set, they'd obviously have to get permission from them, but that's good data, right? Having that ethically sourced, up-to-date, properly structured, well-cleaned, and diverse data set is going to be essential. Obviously, if you're looking for something more like sentiment analysis, Amazon reviews data sets might be a little hit or miss, could also be really good, right? That's a lot of information. I would probably take Amazon reviews over a Yelp data set, just because Yelp bombers exist, right? But is there a way to use a bad data set and just train away from the problematic parts of it? That's what I always get curious about.
Well, this actually kind of segues nicely into my next question, which is about diverse data. You guys have talked about obviously different sets of data and how that can affect the output that you get on your AI. So how can diverse data sets help in mitigating bias?
Kind of to the point I was making earlier, like if you make a point to shoot for things like regular data reviews of the data without a specific kind of box to talk about for a use case, I have to be a little vague here. But if you have a lot of different data sets, a lot of diverse data sets, finding ways to establish protocols for updating them to reflect changes in either the data, social norms, discovered bias, probably important. Actively augmenting data sets with examples of underrepresented groups helps to balance the training data as well. So if you have a lot of different data sets, but you start seeing certain parts of it are getting weighed less based on any reason, right? I'm going to just use the underrepresented groups label. Maybe you change the weights a little bit so it doesn't ignore that group, right? If there's a weight capability there. I think another piece is if you're doing something with like demographic data, don't just dismiss a smaller data set of demographic group data because you don't have much. Seek to expand that so it can have a better impact on the data set as a whole. As not a data scientist, right? I'm talking a little bit out of my wheelhouse. So Nathan, please correct me if any of that's crazy. That's where my head goes, right? Like add more information, give more context, find a way to make sure the data stays up to date, make sure it's good. And then as you start noticing bias, find ways to course correct away from the bias. But what are your thoughts on that with diverse data sets?
I think that's spot on, specifically like as it relates to mitigating that bias, right? It's like we want to have checks and balances along the way to make sure the data we're using is appropriate. I use that word on purpose, right? That's intentional because I don't know that using a lot of data is always the right answer. Like in volume, it is like more data in volume is typically better, but more data broadly is not always better, depending on what you want the model to do, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, for all these GPT style models, broader has been the thing, right? Because they're wanting to do the LLM thing, and you need a lot of data to do that from everywhere. There's been, and I guess my answer is coming from working under the assumption that there's not a lot of folks going after that, right? There's a handful of big players in the market that are conquering that today and spending lots of dollars to go after that. My answer is coming from, okay, so as consumers of that thing who want to have custom models, how do we ensure that what we're introducing to the model doesn't introduce inaccuracies or bias? And I think it kind of goes hand in hand with some ideas that I've seen going around, and that's regarding like vertical AI rather than kind of this horizontal AI. So vertical, for those that may not know, that's the idea of like, I don't need an LLM for my org. I want a bot to do this very specific thing very well, right? So I don't need to necessarily have help me write my emails, have it look at resumes, have it return data from my database. I don't need it to do all those things. I needed to do each of those things well, potentially, right? So
Yeah.
I think that is the most important thing, is making sure the data that we're using is appropriate for the purpose.
Mhm.
And that's the easiest way to eliminate bias within the model itself, right?
Yeah, and I think kind of in that same vein, and this is a catchphrase that comes up a lot just in regular infrastructure services, right? If something goes down, you need to have a human in the loop, and you also need to keep everyone apprised, right? There's this concept of closing the loop from start to finish, verification throughout, right? I think the same thing applies to resolving AI bias, right? To actively throughout the entire developmental cycle of these models, the training data, what they're outputting, having humans in the loop is going to be essential, because I know that if I were to ask people that know how to tie multiple AI model agents together and have them check each other, that's really neat and fancy and flashy because it's brand new. But that's not going to replace a person's oversight, right? A person's going to be much more capable of being like, that does not pass the stink test. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that doesn't look right. We need to do something about that. So humans are going to be essential throughout all steps within any kind of AI initiative. But it's always complex. Like I said, it's usually based on that uncertainty about how it gets from raw data to processed to trained to implemented as a model to then actually doing what it's supposed to do, right? Humans throughout the process is essential.
So let's talk about real world examples. What can you share with us? How have companies successfully addressed AI bias in their systems? Any lessons learned from past mistakes you can share with us?
Yeah, I think I would start by making sure we include the end user as part of the system, right? So I think it's easy to get lost in talking the tech specifically, but I think we've done hopefully a good job of detailing that that's just a portion of it, and potentially even a small portion of making sure that bias generated by an AI model doesn't pose harm, right? Yes, if we are creating models, certainly we need to do our best to make sure the model doesn't have bias. And like John said, the larger corporations who are making these models, they are doing that. The reality is that this is all trained off of humans' output, and humans are biased, right? So with that in mind, the end user of the thing that is built needs to be aware of that, and they need to understand that they have an obligation to ensure that it is accurate and not biased. There's a lot of ways that we can use AI. Some of the use cases are to generate throughput, right? Like increase throughput. And that is awesome, but it's also a little dangerous because, to your point earlier, John, like we need to have, today at least, we need a human in the loop to make sure that the output of this thing is something that we want to represent the user and the company, right?
Right.
There's a lot of implications here. And I think it starts with the user of the tool to make sure that the result is used in an appropriate way.
And I was going to add to it, like I kind of referenced the IBM Fairness 360 toolkit, but I didn't say much. I'm glad we kind of came back to this because originally that toolkit was just for IBM. But then after seeing how well it worked, they decided to create tutorials demonstrating real world use cases in things directly related to things like credit scoring and healthcare use, providing access to an open source. Where it got donated to is the Linux Foundation, by the way, to kind of tell you where it ended up, right? They developed it, had it in-house, and then donated it to the Linux Foundation. So it's open source, it's available, it's out there. Some of the key components to it, right? Bias mitigation algorithms with 70 fairness metrics to quantify bias, 10 state-of-the-art bias mitigation algorithms cooked into it as well. That could give anyone who's working on an AI project geared towards a large set of things, a leg up in making sure that they don't accidentally step in it with a bias situation as a result. And then obviously with that human in the loop portion of it, it's an interactive web experience, right? You have the ability to essentially pull this forward and it be generally available. It's on GitHub. It's not locked away in some inaccessible closet at IBM's multiple facilities. It's out there in the world, but it gives a comprehensive set of tools to help AI developers and data scientists create more fair and unbiased machine learning models across, name a domain or application. So I think that's a success story for humanity in the sense of mitigating bias, right? One direct, clear-cut case of an organization like IBM who's been around forever, acknowledging the fact that this bleeding edge tech it's exciting, it's got a whole lot of power to it, but it's also dangerous, right? If you take what we've been saying and replace the words AI with a knife the whole time, a lot of what we're saying still kind of holds true, right? If you think of AI as a tool, or you think of it as a Swiss Army knife, how you use it matters. What's the intent? Just as if your intent is to slice a loaf of bread, how do you know how to slice the loaf of bread? Most people know it's like this, but what if you did it long ways and then the bread looks goofy? Long story short, it's important to think about how, what's the goal? And obviously that's going to kind of set you on the path to make sure that you do look for the things to kind of insulate you from accidentally making more problems, or like I said a minute ago, cutting the bread the wrong way.
I know we talked about Reddit and not going over there and not using their data set, but I'm sure that there's got to be a Reddit thread about how do you cut a sandwich. So
Oh yeah, without a doubt. We could train we could train a small language model on it, and that'd be really funny.
All right, guys. So before we go, let's talk about the future. How can we prepare for future ethical challenges in AI?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to training. I think in my mind, we've talked a little bit about the accountability of the persons creating the models and the consumer, all of us, the accountability we have. But I think we, probably the four of us talking right now, aren't necessarily representative of everybody, right? Like we get exposure because we work in IT, so we see a lot, hear a lot, etc. There's a large portion of the workforce that is going to have AI pushed upon them as, it doesn't do everything today, but next 5 to 10 years, it's probably going to do a lot. So it's going to get shoved into their daily workflow. And I was reading last week an article where they mentioned that they think before 2027 that 6 out of 10 workers are going to need training because there's going to be significant changes to how they do work today. And I think that applies to both, like, functionally, how do I do my job in this era, but also ethically, socially, how do I use this tool as well? And I think corporations are going to want to make sure that they're providing that training for their employees to make sure they're getting the most value out of the tool, and that the employees as productive as possible with the tool, but also to avoid any possible repercussions of like negative use of the tool.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point about training, and I 100% agree with you. And I also think that it could be an education thing, right? As this becomes more popular, the joke I'll make is I remember when we had a keyboard class, right? You play the stupid paw game, you type in the words, you learn how to type, and now I can type 120 words a minute or whatever, right? I think it's kind of beholden on the education system at some point to get involved. As these become more widely used, prompting classes should be required learning at a high school. I think that that's only going to set up people in the future to be successful. I also think that workplaces should be looking at things like workshops, seminars, finding ways to cover topics like fairness, accountability, prompting, knowing the impact of your utilization, also what you're getting out of it and how you're using it, right, are going to be essential. I think another thing that often probably gets glossed over with every technological development is an ethical framework development step. Should that be decided by a governing body? Should that be decided by each individual organization? I don't have the answer to that, but I'd imagine that if, like you said, by 2027, 6 out of 10 people should have some kind of training related to AI. Who is going to be the central force pushing for what those standards are, right? And then how are those ethically being implemented? And then I think the last piece is, unfortunately, in other countries that aren't like the US, that might be a little bit behind on this, they're going to also fall behind on regulations and policies surrounding their AI implementations and use,
Yep.
right? I think in a country like ours, where we're kind of on the forefront of it and seeking to do so, the government does have a hand to play in regulation of these tools, which is tricky. What level of government is that? I don't have the answer, but regardless of whether or not regulations are implemented, I think it's beholden on people that are involved in the development of this kind of AI gold age, gold rush that we're in, to be a participant and try to push for some semblance of involvement from those bodies. Because that way, 15 years from now, the worst that everyone talks about being Skynet, which is the hilarious, you can't hear an AI conversation without it coming up.
Shout out.
Right? It's the only way it can be avoided, is if everyone's involved in making sure it doesn't happen. You know what I mean? To some extent. So hopefully that kind of meets the mail with the future ethical challenges and preparing for them, because it's not going to get easier, but the only way it will is if people start getting on top of it.
No, nice shout out to Skynet. If you're listening, the four of us, we like you. We're trying to do our best. I think one of the key things that you both mentioned here towards the end is the workforce, how it affects that, and how, I mean, because as you were talking now, John, I was thinking about, different jobs. You look at a realtor, for example, somebody who's in that kind of field, like they could use AI to help, with their, what do you
Like
call it, with their sales listings. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Things like that. But then when we're talking about ethics and bias, like how much is too much in that world? Same thing with like somebody in finance. Like, how can you, I mean, I'm sure they could use AI to some degree in finance. I don't know how, don't ask me. I'm not a numbers guy. That's why I'm in HR.
Yeah.
But there's got to be some useful way to do that. And then how do you make sure you don't cross that line? And so I kept thinking about different jobs, and as you were talking, and just how important it is, like Nathan was mentioning, the training aspect of it. Because right now I feel like everybody uses it to some degree. Everybody has some sort of useful, hey, let me go in here and ask it this, give it this simple prompt. We were talking about simple prompts earlier, and they might be happy with that return from that simple prompt. Like, oh yeah, I can use this in my work product. Should you use that in your work product? Like,
right.
I mean, I don't know. Should you maybe dive into this, like you were saying, a little bit deeper and kind of prompt it a little bit more so you can maybe get a better answer so you can actually use it in that work product? Obviously, always the caveat, like read things through, never just copy and paste what you get back from any of these GPT models. And that's very key. But obviously, a lot of people that don't have the know-how that maybe we do, because we're in the tech industry, we know better than to just take that first answer and take its word for it. It's like, great, yes, this is what I need.
And this harkens back to something that I feel very strongly about with automation, right? Just in general, even if it's just someone writing a script to do a thing so they don't have to manually do it. Any kind of technological advancement should be done in the spirit of improving people's productivity, not replacing them, right?
Yep.
Just like you mentioned with your example, another one that I could easily see happening is, so in the past, we'll say 5 years, McDonald's has shifted away from having someone at the counter and having you go to the big giant tablet TV, right? Would it be that shocking if within the next 3 years, there's not even a tablet, it's a fake virtual agent that is a AI generated looking person behind a counter ringing you up, having a conversation with you. Hey, what would you like to eat today? Hope you're having a nice day. Oh, okay, great. We'll get you 2 Big Macs and blah, blah, blah. It'll be $15 or whatever, right? Is that a good implementation of AI? Is that an ethical implementation of AI? I'm not going to answer that question, but I know a lot of people will have a direct answer to it, right? To me, I think it's important that any kind of improvement with technology needs to be treated as like I said, a tool, not a replacement.
Well, let me just first say that if in 5 years I get something like that and a couple of Big Macs are $15, yay for AI, because right now that's not the case. But
Yeah, man, true.
I think that was
But-
sandwich only in his example.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't
Yeah.
the meat.
minus the bun, yeah. And the special sauce.
Right.
All right, guys. It's been a pleasure to have you on Ask Anything with us today to talk about AI. Thank you very much for joining us, Nathan Rinard and John Caviness. Thanks, guys.
Great
Yes, sir.
seeing you.
Thank you.
Good
Bye.
times.
Thanks for listening into this week's edition of Ask Anything presented by Moser Consulting. We hope you enjoyed listening to our conversation with Nathan Rinard and John Caviness about ethics and bias in AI. Be sure to join us next time as we dive even deeper with our resident experts and explore what they're currently working on. Don't forget to share your ideas or topics with us on social media. In the meantime, please remember to give us a rating and subscribe to our feed wherever you get your podcasts. Until then, so long, everybody.
Go.